I started murdering people, there'd be none of you left.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
Disclaimer. The following broadcast gives a true and honest account of the events described, and all evidence and details herein are solely factual. What you are about to hear is real and may disturb you. Caution is strongly advised. Welcome to Dead Souls Social Club.
If you enjoy our show and find our research interesting, please leave us a 5-star review on your chosen podcast platform. Something that small really does go a long way in helping us out. You can find out more about us by heading over to Instagram and searching our name. Tonight we're diving straight in. Tucker and Putin. Let's go. So, you all saw that ex-Fox News journalist Tucker Carlson has recently been to Russia to interview their leader, Vladimir Putin. Expectedly, there has been a media and social media circus surrounding the interview, which Carlson released on the X social platform. Why the outrage? Is it because Tucker is a traitor to the United States by speaking with the leader of the perceived enemy? Or is it because Tucker's conversation with Putin might share with the Western people an entirely different perspective on an extremely significant and hugely polarizing issue, the war in Ukraine? Over the last week, since the interview was published on X, formerly Twitter, those two polarizing camps, who were split before regarding Putin, remain very much still split now. Was the Western world able to gain access to a perspective on a topic that could change the trajectory of world events that the establishment would rather we wouldn't have? Well, not exactly. I try not to share my political views or opinions. I try to approach things naturally and from a factual and provable viewpoint. A point that, I might add, that all decent journalists should work from too. Although I am not a journalist, and this isn't a news program, just to be clear. I'm going to approach my analysis of this interview as unbiased as possible, but where I do share my opinion, I will state why I think that way and what facts guide my opinion. Now, what is a journalist exactly? We all think we know. But in its basic form, a journalist is an individual who collects and gathers information in the form of text, audio, or pictures, processes it into a newsworthy format, and disseminates it to the public. Since journalism began in the 1690s, there has always been a basic and major rule that journalists should always follow. Always tell the truth, no matter what. Tell the truth and show each side of the story that you are reporting on. Unfortunately, this doesn't happen as much anymore as it used to, shall we say. In fact, one of the things I notice most on my regular trips to the United States is how the television news reporters and presenters often share their opinions with the viewing public, on air, turning the news into a kind of live op-ed or opinion piece rather than factual news. It degrades journalistic integrity as the news isn't being reported. No, the opinion of one person, including any biases that they may have, are being reported instead. In regularity, and to a large audience, this is a form of propaganda, especially when the organization behind the presenter who is sharing these regular op-eds have a consistent and unwavering specific viewpoint or political agenda that they wish to share. But to be clear, no laws are being broken. A journalist is under no legal obligation to tell the truth. There are no laws in the United States, Canada, United Kingdom, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, or any other Western nations that specifically states that a journalist should tell the truth. Now, that's not to say that media and journalistic employers don't have their own internal policies on reporting the truth, of course. But all that aside, I will let you decide how appropriate it is for a journalist to report the unbiased truth and ensure that all sides of an opinion are represented in their journalistic output. Now, let's be under no illusion. let's be clear on who Tucker Carlson is. Tucker Carlson is a right-wing conservative political commentator and one of the highest profile proponents of Donald Trump. All facts. He is a leading voice in what is referred to as white grievance politics. He has openly promoted and substantiated conspiracy theories and on multiple occasions has made racist, sexist and homophobic remarks and slurs on national television. Further facts. Carlson previously hosted various news and political commentary shows for Fox News from 2009 until he was dismissed from his position in 2023 for a variety of reasons, including grandstanding, racism, criticism of Fox News owners and senior management, sexism, and his strong religious extremism comments. For those interested in the specifics, I encourage you to Google the details. There is no shortage of leaked information across various news outlets. Continued facts. Tucker Carlson is a Republican. He was previously registered as a Democrat between 2006 to 2020. In 2017, Carlson came forward and admitted that he was never truly a Democrat supporter. Carlson has stated that his registration as a Democrat was to gain the ability to vote in election primaries, and that he, quote, sincerely despises the Democratic Party. Further, Carlson has stated that as a fake Democrat, he, quote, always voted for the more corrupt candidate over the idealist. This was in order to favour the status quo and stem progressivism, he has stated. Carlson has also actively campaigned for Republicans, the Republican Party, and Republican causes throughout his entire time as a registered Democrat. Although you cannot help thinking that such a staunch Republican conservative voting in Democrat Party politics is somewhat suspect and, if nothing else, utterly disingenuous. Though you can take him at his word too. You be the judge. So that's Tucker anyway. So before the interview has even taken place, we know that's the character of the man representing Western unbiased journalism and views. Did you know that before the interview 2 weeks ago with Putin, multiple Western news agencies has reached out to the Kremlin to request an interview with Putin regarding the Ukraine war and his current thinking? It was the Kremlin and reportedly Putin himself who chose Tucker Carlson and Tucker Carlson alone. For further clarity, I think it's fair to say that most American, British, Australian and Canadians are not that informed on Ukraine or Russia. They have no real idea what's actually happening in either of those countries, or even more specifically the war between the nations. Generally, what's mainly reported in the Western press is the funding and weaponry commitments by those nations to Ukraine, and occasionally territory control maps, which are often flashed up in news reports while the war is discussed. Before we get any further into this mini-episode, I'd just like to clarify that I am no Putin apologist. I don't doubt that living in Russia under Putin is terrible. A poor economy due to world sanctions, no freedom of the press, an oppressive government regime, homophobic and racially oppressive laws, a corrupt leadership and significant Russian mafia control of some of the country's largest industries and governmental departments are just some of the hardships the citizens of Russia live with daily. But at the same time, I also think it's at least worthwhile for the West to listen to the Russian viewpoint regarding the war. It's the only way an honest interpretation of what is happening and why can be consolidated. So, Tucker C spent the week prior to his interview with Putin in Moscow filming supplementary footage to accompany his interview broadcast. Tucker going for a meal in a fine restaurant, riding the Moscow metro, shopping in Russian supermarkets, etc. It appears to be framed as a, look, Russia is great, it's not bad at all, check out all this cool stuff kind of angle. And maybe that's not a bad thing at all. I'm sure the West could do with seeing the positive sides of Russian culture. But is that also a bit disingenuous? After all, I'm sure the average Westerner would say that they have no quarrel or argument with the average Russian citizen. The West know that Russians aren't aliens. They live in a society much like ours. They go to work, they love their families, they enjoy their free time and might engage in a hobby or two. All that is obvious. But is the normalcy of Russian culture being spun into the image of Putin? Think about that. I'll let you decide. But who are the Western powers at loggerheads with? Putin and his regime, or the Russian people? Moving on. The narrative in the West is that Putin is a madman and an expansionist, that Putin started the Ukraine war without any provocation, and that Putin has rejected all overtures towards peace. That Putin's reason for justifying his Ukrainian war is to tackle what he perceives as a nation being ruled by Nazis and Nazi sympathizers, but also to retake land that rightfully belongs to Russia. That Putin is a criminal ruler of a fake democracy, and that Putin is a threat to Western ideals, democracy, freedom, and is aiming to escalate his warmongering and international destabilization of the West. You can also say that Ukraine is an independent nation, sovereign and with the right to exist and run their country how they so wish. And with that, they should be able to join NATO if they so wish, right? But, with countries joining NATO getting ever closer to the Russian border, can you also understand why Russia is nervous about being so closely bordered with what is essentially perceived by Russia as enemies on multiple fronts? Remember, Russia asked to join NATO in the 1990s and was flatly refused. So Russia perceives NATO as a group that is ever growing closer to its borders and has specifically alienated them and refused to let them join their group. You can see their unease, right? But we will come back to that in a bit, particularly the part about Russia requesting to join NATO in the 1990s. I'm not going to touch on what the value of NATO is in this current age or how NATO is benefiting you. I'll let you form your own opinions on that. If nothing else, Google its purpose if you aren't sure why they exist and who specifically they are. But let's talk about the interview between Carlson and Putin. We'll discuss Putin's background and history later. So, the interview itself began with a long and rambling half-hour lecture on the history of Russia and Ukraine. I do think that's fair to say. Whether you are supportive of Putin or not, that was a poor and laborious kickoff to what was pitched as a major event interview. As a seasoned journalist, Carlson should have taken more control of the conversation. I think he interjected twice in 30 minutes and was scolded by Putin, so I can also understand that he was slightly nervous to try again. That said, it provided an early insight into what was about to unfold. Putin had a message and things that he wanted to say, and he would not deviate or allow Carlson to get in the way of that script. You could argue Carlson got played, or that this is exactly what Carlson wanted to happen. Carlson frequently appeared somewhat bewildered in the initial 30-minute history lesson. Listening to Putin as he expounded at great length and detail about the origins of Russian statehood in the 9th century. Listening, but almost certainly caught off guard. Ukraine is an artificial state and collaborated with Hitler, Putin said. Putin, however, chose not to touch on the fact that almost 1.5 million Russians also collaborated with Hitler during the Second World War. They chose to join the German military against Stalin as part of the Hilfswilge unit. Ukrainian collaborators only numbered 180,000 in comparison. The Soviet Union also invaded Poland along with Hitler's Germany in 1939, and only joined the Allies when Hitler double-crossed Russia and attacked it in 1941 with Operation Barbarossa. Anyway, potato potato, right? Much of Putin's history lesson, as we'll call it, was taken from an essay that Putin himself wrote, a now infamous 5,000-word essay titled On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians, which was written by Putin in 2021. It's actually now a mandatory document that all members of the Russian military must read upon joining the armed forces. This is according to Russian business newspaper RBK Daily. In that essay, Putin laid out the intellectual justification that the Kremlin then used for its invasion of Ukraine a few months later. Multiple world leaders have called the document complete fabrication. Well-renowned historians have also since come forward and stated that in that essay, Putin makes a litany of claims which are considered entirely nonsense, with many of the claims not appearing in any other historic literature. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a research-based non-political think tank from Washington, D.C., called the essay a, quote, historical, political and security predicate for invading Ukraine. The Stockholm Free World Forum, a Swedish foreign policy think tank, made a similar statement via a senior fellow by the name of Anders Asland, who branded the essay as, quote, "one step short of a declaration of war." Professor of History at Yale University and a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, Timothy Snyder, described the document and Putin's ideas as pure imperialism. Edward Lucas, who is a British journalist for The Times and The Economist, has stated that Putin's document is historical revisionism. Whilst the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law actually issued a report signed by 35 legal and genocide experts. In their report, they cited Putin's essay as part of a, quote, "document to lay the groundwork for incitement of genocide by denying the existence of the Ukrainian group. Nothing more." Russian media has been tight-lipped on their interpretation of Putin's document. The same for Russian historians. They haven't refuted it, but neither have they spoken out about its accuracy. The silence is worth noting. One Russian journalist who reports for Al Jazeera by the name of Niko Vorobyov has commented on the essay from Putin and has written an article calling into question its accuracy and historical precision. So, is Putin utilizing a highly questionable version of history to justify the war in Ukraine? Well, partially. That can be said with confidence and knowledge, based on the historical fact. But regardless of the historical realities, none of Putin's assertions would form a legal justification for his invasion in the eyes of international law. International law which Russia themselves subscribe to. Now, just for historical clarity, Putin began the interview by claiming that the year 862 was when the establishment of the Russian state took place. This was the year that Rurik, a Scandinavian prince, was invited to rule over the city of Novgorod, which was the capital of Rus at the time. The Rus were the people who would eventually develop into what we know today as Russians. Putin contrasts that he claims in the unbroken tradition of Russian statehood dating back to the 9th century with the modern invention, as he puts it, of Ukraine, a country Putin insists was created as recently as the 20th century. Sergei Radchenko, who is a historian at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, says that the president's claim is a complete falsehood, echoing the claims of many aforementioned quotees as well as multiple other sources. Vladimir Putin is trying to construct a narrative backwards by saying Russia, as a state, began its development in the 9th century. But you could equally say that Ukraine as a state began its development in the 9th century also, exactly with the same kind of evidence and documents, Radchenko commented. Putin is trying to use certain historical facts to construct a state-centered narrative that would favor Russia as opposed to any alternative agglomerations. The Rus were a fairly ragtag group who were not nationalist in the slightest. They were made up of bandits and raiders, who were known to have burned their own capital on repeated occasions. Now I mean this factually, with no disparaging intent. They existed well over 1,000 years ago. Please bear that in mind. Putin, it has been claimed, is repeating an established mythology that's made up at certain points in the past by Muscovite Tsars who trace their lineage back to Rurik. This mythology was crystallized in Moscow to justify their imperial hold over Ukraine. It's a justification that's actually similar to what Hitler's Nazi Party rolled out prior to the Second World War, where the state created a false history of German Aryan history. During the interview, President Putin told Tucker Carlson that by the 17th century, when Poland came to rule over parts of present-day Ukraine, they introduced the idea that the population of those areas were not exactly Russians. This was because, he said, they lived on the fringe. They were Ukrainians. Originally, Putin said, the word Ukrainian meant that the person was living on the outskirts of the state, along the fringes. This is a deceiving comment from Putin, as although a national consciousness emerged later among Ukrainians compared to, say, some other Central European nations, there was in fact genuine Ukrainians during that period. Russian history books as well as Western equivalents both share this opinion. A History of Russia by Russian professor Nicholas V. Rosanovsky is one such credible example. Now, while it may be true that Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians share the same origins, through time they developed into different peoples. This is the standard and agreed worldwide interpretation of the history of Russia and Ukraine. The only document contrary to that established history is Putin's document published as a precursor to the Ukraine conflict. President Vladimir Putin made claims that areas in the south and east of Ukraine are, quote, had no historical connection with Ukraine whatsoever, unquote. Putin added that they were conquered from the Ottoman Empire by the Russian Empress Catherine the Great in the 17th century. The Russian president stated that these lands are rightfully Russian. Putin later refers to the lands using the 18th century term Novorossiya, or New Russia. Factually, however, the inhabitants of these lands, when they were conquered by Russia, were neither Russian nor Ukrainian. They were actually Ottoman, Tatar, and Cossacks, Slavic peasants who had fled to the frontiers. Now, I can understand why claiming these territories are rightfully Russian by Putin. It serves Putin's interests, as they are the exact areas that Russia is attempting to conquer from Ukraine. What a mad coincidence, right? The so-called, by Putin at least, Novorossiya includes Crimea, which was annexed from Ukraine in 2014. New Russia also covers the areas of Mariupol, Bakhmut, and Kherson, which Putin declared part of Russia in 2022. And they are the locations of some of the heaviest fighting in the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Fun fact, however, Crimea was originally the Principality of Theodoro and part of the Kingdom of Greece back in the 14th century. During the interview, Putin went on to claim that Ukraine is actually an artificial state that was shaped at Joseph Stalin's will. He argues that Ukraine was created by the Soviet leadership in the 1920s and received lands to which it had no historical claim. Now, even though Ukraine had been a sovereign state known as Zaporizhian Sich as far back as the 13th century, what Putin also doesn't talk about is that historically, lands all over the world have changed hands and ownership many, many times, and regardless of whom created the current borders on a map, it's ultimately the people who inhabit those lands who have ultimate say regarding their sovereignty. Are the United States meant to give up their country to the Native American tribes? Are Australians meant to forego their nation to Aboriginal tribesmen? In fact, I suggest you Google the history of the countries of Africa if you really want a mindfuck of who the hell owns what. I guess in world history, I was here first doesn't really hold up, unless you are Vladimir Putin, of course. I will allow Putin this though. The Soviet leadership did draw up the current borders of the former Soviet republics in the same way that the Western colonial powers drew up borders in Africa, and with very little reasoning behind them. But of course, that does not mean that Ukrainians did not exist. You can't simply erase almost 1300 years of existence and history. More broadly, any country, in theory, is a fake country, in the sense that countries are created as a result of a historical process. The world progresses and changes over time. Kingdoms and republics rise and fall. Russia itself was created as a result of decisions taken by the Russian Tsars, such as the colonization of Siberia, which came at the expense of the local population, who of course are the ethnic Siberians, not the Russians. In fact, the Urgic people, Manchu Tungus, Mongolic, Turkic and Alud people still make up a significant proportion of the Siberian population, and they are about as Russian as the Ukrainians. Simply put, if Ukraine is a fake country, then so is Russia. If Russia wishes to take back lands that were, in their view, historically theirs, does that mean they would also give up lands that were historically not theirs? Right. Let's jump ahead further into Putin's interview with Tucker, shall we? I briefly touched on this earlier, so let's look closer at Putin's claims of Ukraine's collaboration with Hitler. Now, this is potentially Putin's most inflammatory claim, and also pretty damaging to Poland also. Putin claimed that Poland, which was invaded by both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in 1939, had collaborated with Hitler. I'm going to flex a little on this because I have studied World War II intensely over the years. It's been a deep interest of mine since I was a teenager. Now, the Russian president told Tucker that by refusing to concede an area of Poland called the Danzig Corridor to Hitler, Poland went too far, thus pushing Hitler to start World War II by attacking them in response. President Putin's interpretation of history is significantly flawed here if he really believes those claims match the genuine historical record. While it is true that there were diplomatic contacts between Poland and the Nazis in the 1930s, the first treaty Hitler actually signed after coming to power was a non-aggression pact with Poland in 1934. Putin is conflating diplomatic outreach to a threatening neighbour with collaboration. This presumption, or rather accusation, is entirely absurd in this instance. The accusation that the Poles were collaborating is complete fabrication. You can't interpret these things as if there was collaboration with Nazi Germany, because it just so happened that the Soviet Union also signed non-aggression treaties with Germany at the same time, and Russia even supported Germany's war effort before Germany eventually turned their aggression on them. In fact, in September 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union invaded Poland together, according to the terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed between both states earlier that year. The Soviet Union collaborated with Hitler's Nazi regime for 2 whole years, also providing military hardware and intelligence assistance. The brutality of the Soviet occupation of eastern Poland at the time they invaded alongside the Nazis included massacres, looting, and widespread rapes amongst other war crimes. It's a very taboo subject in Russia, even in the present day. In fact, under Russian legislation which was adopted in May 2014 at Putin's behest, there are tight laws surrounding the subject. The legislation allows criminal charges, punishable by up to 5 years in prison as well as large fines, to be brought against anyone in Russia who, quote, spreads information regarding military and memorial commemorative dates related to Russia's defense that is clearly disrespectful of society. Also, quote, anyone who spreads intentionally false information about the Soviet Union's activities during World War II is open to punishment with imprisonment and large monetary fines. Russian historians and scholars have been banned since 2014 of researching any Russian military activities that are not considered to be heroic or positive in action. But anyway, let's move on. During the interview, Putin also made the following claims. Firstly, that he has no interest in attacking a NATO country. The example given was Poland, but Putin clarified that he would only attack Poland, or any other NATO country for that matter, if they were to attack Russia first. Self-defense are the only reasons. I guess we can only take him on his word in regards to that statement. Although, given the poor status of Russia's military, diminishing troop numbers, outdated and poor condition of hardware, and limited military finances, I don't think Putin is in a very strong position for a war against a military alliance of 31 other countries. Although saying that just means it's all the more likely that Putin will go straight to the nuclear option. That said, the GRU, Russia's intelligence service and current-day version of the KGB, are, and have been over the last decade or so, active in espionage and covert attempts to destabilize NATO countries and split the NATO alliance, sabotaging any potential adversary of Russia. Donald Trump, if re-elected as United States President on November the 5th, will be a huge win for Russia, given Trump's isolation stance for the United States, and also his distaste for NATO, America's closest allies for close to a century. Putin said to Carlson that in his opinion the West are creating a fake Russian threat in the media, a propaganda war against Russia that Russia is unable to fight back against given how pretty much all global media organizations are Western-owned. He has stated that while many Russians consume Western media, or at least the Western media that is permitted to be broadcast in Russia, very few Westerners consume any Russian media. I gave some thought to these comments. Many of the Western allies, such as the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Europe, all share a common language and very similar cultures, values, and societal structures. The lives of people in all those countries are pretty similar and consistent, and thus the media would universally appeal and be relevant across most Western borders. Russia, firstly, is a language not widely spoken in any Western countries, so their media would right away be difficult to understand by Westerners. But more so, Russia's media is tightly regulated and monitored by the Russian government. Unable to be critical in any way towards Russia or its government, it means that accuracy, credibility, and at times honesty is called into question. Certainly more than it would be if it was distributed by a nation whose constitution guaranteed free speech. That would be the most significant factor, I think, in why Russian media doesn't flow the other way. But I think it's also a big reason why the West don't understand Russia. Our understanding and sight of the country and culture is extremely limited. Now, I'm sure those of you who are listening and have a favourable view of Russia, or at least a sceptical view of the Western governments, might be thinking, oh, come on, man, you're buying into their bullshit. They want you to hate and distrust Russia. Well, to be clear, I'm just sharing what I can evidence through research. Russia's state control over their media is no secret, not even in Russia. In fact, I encourage you to search up the Russian law called, quote, the Foreign Agent Law. It's a piece of legislation that Putin introduced in Russia in 2012 that highly controls media and opinion right down to the individual citizen level. Also, I don't hate Russia, not at all. I have no quarrel with the Russian people, and I've even met a few, and they've been absolutely lovely. Plus, I appreciate Russia's rich history and incredible literature. Now, one point that was only briefly touched upon in Putin's interview, which I thought was a very good and entirely rational point, was one in regards to the reasons for justification of the Ukraine conflict. That is, Russia's ongoing concerns about NATO expanding right up to Russia's border on multiple fronts, despite previously telling Russia that NATO wouldn't do this. I think this is a very valid point and a very valid concern for Putin. Imagine if you were a country and your enemy was creeping nearer and nearer all around you in every direction and placing weapons at their border with you. Now, I don't know about you, but personally, I'd be quite nervous as to what their intent was. Now, Putin doesn't dwell on this point for too long, likely because, as Russia invaded Ukraine, they are effectively the aggressor in this situation. So, for Putin to say, we invaded Ukraine to stop NATO expansion, would be a precursor to increase his intentions and a potential escalation. Plus, if you think about it, it's essentially saying, hey, we invaded you because we are worried that you'll invade us. Not that Ukraine and NATO were close enough in this situation, of course. Also worth considering is that it wouldn't look good for Putin in the eyes of his own country's citizens too. Had Putin not invaded Ukraine and instead sung to high heavens about his NATO expansion concerns, I think he would have been in a stronger international position. But hey, you can't undo what already happened, right? But nevertheless, it's NATO expansion which is why Russia can claim victim and accuse NATO of being the aggressor. It's in these next areas where the waters get most muddy. NATO will argue, adding more to their ranks creates a stronger alliance, thus protecting their way of life. NATO states that they are a defensive organization, and when one member state is attacked, united, all 31 states will retaliate. NATO state that they need to remain united in light of aggressive nations. Enemy states with evidence of war crimes, poor human rights, lack of freedom for their citizens, oppressive policies and expansionist views, thus threatening the sovereignty of other nations. Valid points at face value, I suppose. Russia will argue that it poses no threat to any nation unless they are attacked first, where they will defend themselves. Russia state that they have the right to their sovereignty, as does any other nation, and they have a right to protect themselves if they are threatened. They wish to be afforded the respect as a sovereign country that they will reciprocate in kind. Again, all very valid points at face value. What is clear from the interview is that Putin is not done with this war just yet. Sure, he accused Boris Johnson of scuppering peace talks early in the conflict, but when pushed by Carlson on whether he would be satisfied with current territories gained if there was a ceasefire tomorrow, Putin did not answer. Ultimately, the interview with Putin was a wasted opportunity. Putin continued to push his narrative for his invasion of Ukraine with justification that had been relayed many times over the past 2 years since the invasion began. No matter which side you support, it's very difficult to not clearly see the holes in Putin's narrative. It only takes minutes to debunk President Putin's claims. Meanwhile, Carlson avoided any topics that could have been deemed sensitive for the Kremlin, even if they were the topics he really should have challenged Putin over. Things like the reports of Russian war crimes in Bucha and Mariupol, the International Criminal Court arrest warrant for Putin, Alexei Navalny and other political prisoners, and of Russia's mobilization and wartime death toll. Those certainly would have been newsworthy questions and answers. Carlson even steered clear of any questions about the upcoming Russian presidential election and the recent disqualification of anti-war candidate Boris Nidzhedin. A missed opportunity and a fluff piece intended for Republicans to sympathize with Putin and block further weapons and aid to Ukraine. Possibly. Putin, however, took full advantage of the opportunity to plant seeds of doubt about America's support of Ukraine and the US political system overall, during an election year of all times. Putin took no responsibility and showed no regrets for Russia's actions in Ukraine. Who knows? Maybe he actually believes his own rhetoric. Spokivoi mechi nisem.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to our show tonight. Be sure to leave us a 5-star review on your chosen podcast platform and subscribe to our show so that you never miss an episode. Our shows aren't sponsored by any company or corporation, so any support you can give us goes a long way in supporting the work that we do. From all of us here at Dead Souls, sleep tight.